This is Dateline News and Conversation. I have a great show for you tonight. The topic, dissent, protests, censorship, and punishment. My guests tonight are my longtime good friend, Bruce Gagnon from Brunswick, Maine, and a new guest tonight. He's a professor at Colby College in my hometown of Waterville, Maine, Luke Brooks-Shesler. Guys, welcome to the show.
Hey, nice to be here.
Good to see you.
Always, always, always. All right, let's get right at it. Dissent. It's happening everywhere. It's happening all across Europe. I mean, massive, massive protests with hundreds of thousands of people in many of Europe's larger cities, in Germany, in France, and Italy. And I know that it's happening in the United States, and I know that the two of you have been dissenting across the state of Maine. So I want to start with you first, Bruce, because you and I go back a long way with protests in the state of Maine. Tell me a little bit about what you're doing right now. You've got an incredible, I would call it a campaign to bring awareness to the people in Maine, and you really are expressing dissent in terms of the American narrative and American foreign policy. So, Bruce, take it away.
Well, excuse me, I like the word campaign. That is how I see it. Just today, in fact, every Thursday, today's Thursday, I was out on the street for an hour with two friends at a key intersection in my town in Brunswick, holding my sign that says no more money for Ukraine, no more war money. And we were there for an hour, and I've been doing this every week, every Thursday since what Russia calls the special military operation began in February of 22. Missed maybe 6 times because of terrible weather, or I had to go out of town. And we're seeing a real transition at even this local protest. People are beginning to come around. More people are waving, giving peace signs, honking. But today, one guy he walked up from a distance and started yelling. So I went over to see what he had to say. And he was shaking. He was a guy about my age, and he was shaking and saying, why don't you move to Russia, that kind of thing. And I said, after, he went on for a while. And I said, well, can I say something here, And finally, he stopped, and I said, what about the coup in 2014 that the United States organized in Kiev? Lies. That's all lies. I said, what about the Nazis that is propping up the government? That's lies. That's all lies. So anyway, and we went on like this for a few minutes, and finally I just gave up and walked away. But I've noticed that the sign I'm holding now, stop giving our tax dollars to Ukraine, is eliciting more dramatic responses. A lot of times people drive by and they just look straight ahead and they don't want to make any contact. But I'm getting more positive and negative reactions from people than I normally do because of this sign. I think it's really striking home. So that's what I'm all about, is trying to get people to think, get them to take a position one way or the other, and to even talk to us at times. There are some people that stop at the traffic light where we're standing and roll down the window and often say they agree with us and thank us for being there. But in the last, few months, we've been going to about once a month. This month we're doing 2 of them holding statewide protests in different parts of the state and some of the bigger cities around Maine. We've been getting 40 to 50 people at a time, and that's going really well. And in fact, we got covered by the Portland Press Herald, the biggest paper in the state, this last Saturday when we were out in the Portland area. And that was a big step because they've been just blanking us. They're not covering us at all. And the other thing, we've been encouraging people to write letters to the editor, and there's been a few that have been printed lately too. So that's kind of opening up a little bit. Before it was virtually impossible to get a letter to the editor in the paper, and now it's starting to open up. So when we can get people on the street where the public is going to see us because they're driving by, the media can't contain us. They can't ignore us when we're standing on the street having direct contact with the public. So with that and getting some things in the paper, our campaign is certainly picking up, and it's, God knows it's necessary. We've now sent from the United States or over $140 billion to Ukraine. And in fact, I heard the other day that the United States is now funding the Social Security system inside of Ukraine. Now that's interesting because at the same time here in our Congress, they're beginning to talk about cutting Social Security in our country, saying we don't have enough money, that it's running out of money, the Social Security fund. But at the same time, we can fund the Social Security in Ukraine. So now's the time for people to be talking.
All right. So, Bruce, you go back a long way. You've been an organizer trying to inform people about America's foreign policy. And you've been doing this in Maine now, I don't know, for well over, I think, a decade or a dozen years. Have you found that these recent protests, and it's a campaign because you've organized this over a period of days and weeks, are you drawing the same old people, or are you managing to draw new people? And you know, we've got a younger person tonight we'll talk to in a minute, Luke.
Yeah, I'd say it's about 50-50. We're getting some of the regulars, the folks that we've worked with for years. I've been organizing in Maine for 20 years, before that in Florida for 30 years. And but we're also getting a lot of new younger people. The peace movement in Maine is very divided. There are several key groups in the state that refuse to participate with us, to even endorse or sponsor these protests that we're having. They're just like protests that we've been having for years in the state, saying a lot of the same things we've been saying for years. But because of the climate, some people are afraid to stick their neck out, and some groups in the state are afraid to stick their neck out, and thusly they're divided. So yeah, it's about 50-50 right now, but it's fine with me because I believe you go with who you got. And as Yogi Berra, the famous baseball philosopher, said, you can take them to the ball game, but you can't make them go in. So that's my organizing philosophy. You invite people. If they want to come, they come. If they don't come, fine, you move on. And we make new friends, and we build. We keep building.
I'm really happy to hear that it's 50-50. I want to go to Luke now. And Luke, I want to, first of all, welcome you to the show. I hope you will join me in the future, because what the world needs to hear is from young people like yourself, young, educated, articulate people. And so I'd like to know, first of all, from you, how did you get involved in this?
Yeah, so I have to say, as a slight disclaimer, I'm 46, so lately I haven't been feeling as young as I'd like to actually be, but I definitely, you know, anyway, I try to stay young, at least in mind. Yeah, so how did I get involved with this? I think that, I'm relatively new to Dissent and this sort of peace activism, and it's something that's kind of been brewing for me since about 2016 with Russiagate, the whole Russiagate thing, and I was definitely on board. I was on board hook, line, and sinker with this idea that Trump was collaborating with Putin, and that it was just a matter of time before we found, solid evidence of that, and then we would know that Trump was a Russian agent. And I eagerly anticipated the Mueller report. I thought that was going to be the day of reckoning. And then when the Mueller report came out, Mueller found corruption, which I think you would find in any administration. But he didn't actually find evidence of collusion between Trump and Russia. And that was the first time that I really started to think about whether these narratives that we're getting in the media are accurate. In fact, I felt like I had been lied to for years. And I saw the way that that divided the country. And so ever since then, I've been taking a very skeptical view toward the media sources that up until then I had always relied upon. That would be the New York Times, the Washington Post. I was an NPR addict. Those were the main sources of news for me. And I started to look for other independent news sources. And I got a different perspective on the news, a perspective that I thought was maybe a little bit more rational and level-headed, I would say. And through that, I started to get a different perspective on US foreign policy. And now, when I see what's going on in Ukraine, and I feel like I've gotten a good sense of the background to the conflict in Ukraine, I think you can obviously go back to 2014, but I think the roots of the conflict lie decades before that. I think that the conflict is not how our leaders have portrayed the conflict, and not how the you can call them stenographers in the New York Times and the Washington Post and the Wall Street Journal have portrayed the conflict. And so the past year or two has been a rather lonely time for me, because I feel like I'm getting news that I think is much more accurate from independent sources, but I find myself constantly talking to people who are getting their news from the same sources that I always used to get my news up until a few years ago. And it's actually been a rather lonely experience for me. It's been a rather alienating experience for me. And I would say this applies to my church as well. I'm very active with my church. I have a lot of close friends at my church, but it's been very disappointing and disheartening to bump up against this sort of resistance to alternative perspectives. And so I have been looking for another organization that felt as strongly about peace as I do, an organization that I thought would be more consistent with my spiritual beliefs. And that's when, just through basically searching online, I found out about a peace protest. The first one I attended was about 3 months ago. I think it was the Rage Against the War Machine protest, and we were in Bath, and then we were in Westbrook, Maine. And that's how I got to know Bruce and Lisa Savage and the others who are involved. And ever since then, I just can't tell you how much it's meant to me to be able to be engaged with other like-minded people who are also skeptical of the government line, and who I think are truly committed to peace. And I just want to add that, I'm not pro-Russia. I'm not pro-Ukraine. I am anti-war, and I am pro-peace. And I want the killing to stop. And I want everyone to be able to work their differences out at the negotiating table. That's what I want.
Wow. Sure, I'm glad to have you, and I'm really glad to hear that. You expressed a couple of things that I want to comment on, and probably Bruce will too. You talked about the feeling of being lonely and alienated. Welcome to the club. I mentioned in the title of this show, Dissent, Protest, Censorship, and Punishment. And punishment is not just what Julian Assange is undergoing right now, locked up in a jail, a prison. But punishment is what happens when friends, colleagues, and even church members turn away from us. And it can be a lonely feeling. And you hit the nail right on the head. The secret to getting over that, the loneliness and the alienation, is what you found with a group of people who were protesting, expressing their disagreement and dissent with United States foreign policy. And I have to tell you, I'm pretty lucky that you happen to meet Bruce. I would say foster that relationship. All right, now there's a lot more I want to ask both of you, but I want you to talk about dissent and the different ways that dissent can be expressed, and the risks that are involved in dissenting. Bruce, I'm going to throw it back to you.
Well, you know my story, Regis. I grew up in a military family. I lived on military bases. I went to military-run schools. Growing up, I was reading the We Were There series of books for kids, patriotic series. We were there at the Lexington and Concord, at the Alamo, the Battle of the Bulge, etc. And I internalized all that stuff. And in 1971, during the Vietnam War, I tried to join the Air Force, but I flunked my induction physical because of an old high school football injury. So I had to get a waiver to get into the military when everybody else of good sense was trying to stay out. And after my training, I was sent to a base in California that was an airlift base for the war. And GIs would come there and get on a plane and go to Vietnam. And when the planes came back, they brought the body bags of the dead soldiers, lined up on the runway just across the street from my office. And I would see them day after day after day. And plus, my first roommate was one of the organizers in the GI resistance movement. So it took me about, a couple months. My chair moved into their circle. They'd meet in our room at night, a couple nights a week. And it changed my life. And I've been doing it ever since. And I've lost a lot of friends over the years. Recently, I've lost quite a few friends, actually, in the last year. One guy told me that, well, Bruce, sometimes you realize that people that you thought were your friends weren't really your friends after all. I don't know exactly what he meant by that. I don't know if he was talking about himself, but it was instructive, let me put it that way, and it hurt. But I'm more committed to the truth as I know it and I understand it historically. You put pieces together. I look at everything as a puzzle, put the pieces on the wall and a picture emerges. It becomes clearer all the time. The more pieces you add. And just as Luke said, when you're looking at alternative sources, not just the mainstream orthodoxy, you get new pieces of the puzzle and the picture becomes even more clear. And that's what's happened to me. And that's more important to me than anything else. So if I do lose a few friends, I hope I make a few too. Like in the case of Luke, who now I consider a friend, and I consider him a very exceptional person, a very smart person, and a guy with a good heart. You can see it in his face. You can see it in his smile. And so I'm proud that dissent leads me to further clarity, to further honesty, to further friendships. That's what it's all about.
Always great insight from you, Bruce. All right, Luke, before I bring you back with your opportunity to answer your thoughts on dissent and why it's so important, why it must be allowed. I just want to say, I think you're very fortunate that you had this awakening that took many of us a long, long time to come to. I know that it took me studying in Rome for 4 years in 1968 to 72. For the first time in my life, people from around the world were holding this mirror up to me and saying, look what you're doing in Vietnam. It was the height of the Vietnam War. Racism in the United States and civil rights movement, the cities were burning. And they were holding that up to me. And I went, whoa, wait a minute now. Maybe this isn't the greatest place in the world. And then it took me many, many more years. And going to Jeju Island not only opened my eyes clearly, but changed my life and radicalized me, set my life on a completely different trajectory. So I just think that you're very lucky as a younger person to have come to that the way you did. Now, I'd like your comments on dissent, why it's important, and not only important to be able to speak freely, but isn't this really the basis of what the United States supposedly was founded upon?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, so when we talk about dissent, I think that if you're speaking what you believe to be true, if what you're saying happens to go against the narrative that, certain organizations or the government are promoting, then you should still be allowed to do it, because if you're not allowed to talk about what you think is true based on your, best faith effort to get to the truth, then what ultimately happens is we develop these false narratives, we start operating on false assumptions, and we start making bad decisions, and then reinforcing those bad decisions with even worse decisions that can have cataclysmic consequences. And, when I talk with my friends and I mention something like, I'm really concerned that we're on the brink of nuclear annihilation and the doomsday clock is closer to midnight than it has ever been, I get a response from people who kind of just sort of dismiss that. They're very dismissive of that. There was recently an incident, I think, where a Russian pilot maybe tried to launch a missile at a Polish pilot recently near the Black Sea, and apparently the Russian missile malfunctioned. But that's one of these, we're kind of on the edge of a knife where some kind of miscommunication could actually lead to a larger conflagration. And if we don't get the word out there that, we are this close to a nuclear confrontation and the potential end of humanity, if we can't accept the reality of that, then we increase the risk of that actually happening. If we don't talk the truth to power, if we don't talk about the reality of what's happening, then we're not dealing with reality. We're not making good decisions. So that's why I think that dissent is so important.
I'm glad you brought up the threat of a nuclear Armageddon. I've been concerned about that for a long time. In fact, I made a film that's entitled 30 Seconds to Midnight. I made that film in 2016, 2017, I think. And that's why I came to Russia. I was so afraid that we were that close to nuclear annihilation, closer than we had ever been before during the Cold War and the Cuban Missile Crisis. I entitled the film 30 Seconds to Midnight. At the time, the Bureau of Atomic Scientists had their doomsday clock at 2.5 minutes. And I said, they're either being very conservative or they don't want to scare the public. If I were to issue that film today, I would title it The Final Countdown, 5, 4, 3. You mentioned how close we've come. There have been many of those close calls. My own personal feeling is I hope there's not a crazy Dr. Strangelove in some basement in Washington, D.C. somewhere that'll want to push the button. But I have to tell you, I'm not alone in this. There are many of us who fear an accident, a misjudgment, a false reading on a radar screen, bad communication, so many possibilities for a serious accident to happen. And while we're talking about Ukraine, the UK has sent depleted uranium, which Russia has said is a red line. And just yesterday and today, I'm reading that they're sending some special missiles to Ukraine, long-range missiles. Russia has said, if we are threatened, seriously threatened, and we are attacked, we will respond with our entire arsenal, including nuclear. The United States first gaslighted the world, talking about a limited nuclear war in Ukraine and that Russia would do it. And of course, Russia had to respond to that. And so there are many people in Europe anyway, and I doubt not too many in the States, that have been gaslighted about. If they have been, they're not worried about it. All right, Bruce, I want to come back to you. I want to talk now about your campaign. And I want you both to talk about the campaign. I know you carry signs because you can't talk to people driving by in cars and trucks. Bruce, what are some of the signs? In fact, I'll start with this. I'll ask you a specific question. You and some others carry a sign and say, no weapons to Ukraine. You started out the top of the show saying we spent over $140 billion. What was that money spent on, Bruce?
Well, the money goes to run their government. There was a story by Seymour Hersh in the last 2 weeks saying that Zelensky and his cronies had raked off $40 million for themselves. So they've stolen $40 million. It's buying weapons, which sometimes, according to recent news reports, are being resold by the Ukrainian military on the black market to other countries, for example, to ISIS types in Syria that are trying to topple the elected government of Syria. So, it's massive. There's massive corruption going on. And the thing is, if you could, if we had a real media, let's put it this way, and we could really talk to the American people about all of these things, we'd be in a lot better situation than we are today. But in the case of Seymour Hersh, for example, my wife, just an example, one of her very best friends that she works with, who's a really smart person, a good-hearted person. My wife recently asked her what she knew about the Nord Stream pipeline being blown up by the Biden administration, as reported by Seymour Hersh, Pulitzer Prize-winning journalist. And her friend had never heard of it. That indicates how the corporate media is hiding the truths, the many truths, from the public. If the public were aware of these things, we'd be a lot further along than we are today. So, our signs say everything. No war with Russia, no war with China. Blowing up pipelines is a war crime. Ask Luke what his favorite sign is. He asks for it every time he comes to join our rally these days.
All right, Luke.
Yeah.
What is your favorite sign?
My favorite sign, I think it's the U.S. destroyed the Nord Stream pipelines. I like that sign.
And probably a lot of people like Mary Beth's friend say, oh, gee, what's the Nord Stream pipeline? But maybe, because, they say you got to say something 7 times before people remember it. So maybe that's going to stick. and they're going to run across it somewhere. And see, that's my strategy. It's a long-term strategy. I know it's slow, but what else we got? You know, we got to go with what we have. So, you know, holding signs on street corners is important, but that's why I don't like to just do it once and then give up and say, oh, well, you know, that didn't change anything. I stood out there for an hour today. No, I go every week. I go twice a week, actually, in our town, Thursday and Friday in Brunswick. And now we're doing these statewide protests, 2 this month, one in Portland, the next one next Saturday, the 20th, a week from Saturday, May 20th in Belfast, Maine. So you got to be persistent and consistent. That's the key to organizing.
Well, I want to underscore this. You just can't do whatever you're going to do one time. If it's carrying a sign, or if it's writing a letter. And Bruce, I don't know anybody that's been more consistent and persistent than you have. We go back quite a ways. And I'm not sure that there's a Saturday or a day in any week for the last 20 years that you haven't been on a street corner or you haven't been causing a ruckus somewhere. It's a really important point you made, that you got to keep doing it. You can't just do it once. And it's especially important now, more now than ever, that people come out, and not just one time. And I think I'll go back to what Luke was saying in the beginning. Everybody is feeling somewhat anxious about what's going on, whether they can identify these issues or what, but they know that something's not right in the country. There's so many signs that point to that. And so they have a feeling of loneliness, and many are feeling despair because of what's happening in the country. And by joining a group like this of like-minded people, as Luke pointed out, you feel accepted, you feel reinforced. It's a very important thing to do. All right, Luke, I'm going to come back to you because do you just carry that one sign, the pipeline, or have you carried other signs? And if you haven't, then I'm going to ask you specifically about one sign that I like.
Yeah, actually, so I'll carry pretty much any sign that people hand me. There was another sign, I think it was Stop the Warhawks, and it was Sullivan, Newland, Blinken. I don't think Biden's name was on there, but yeah, for sure. Stop the Warhawks. I think I made a sign one time that said something about, you know, $100 billion to Ukraine, like no. So I like the signs about not, you know, that say how much we're funding the war in Ukraine.
All right. Bruce, there's a couple I want to ask you, and some people may not get the connection, like all the rest of these issues. No to NATO. Either that's one of your favorite signs, or I don't know, maybe somebody close to you, but I know I've seen that sign often.
Yeah, and NATO is offensive. That's another sign that I've used frequently. I change it up every now and then. I go with the same sign for a few weeks in a row because I would really want to hammer that message in. And then I change it up and go with a different one for a while. But NATO is a big concern. NATO is expanding globally. North Atlantic Treaty Organization, NATO, now going global, moving into the Asia Pacific. They're opening an office formally in Japan, in Tokyo. Why? Well, because they are the military arm of corporate capital of the empire. The empire is collapsing. They've determined that they're willing to risk the world to stay in charge, to stay dominant, to stay king of the hill. And they are maneuvering in that direction. They're cutting social spending throughout NATO countries. They're increasing NATO budgets. They're moving, especially naval forces, into the Asia Pacific aimed at China. The idea is to choke off China's importation of resources through the South China Sea. put a loaded gun to China's head. Basically, tell them to submit to US, NATO control, Western control, or we will take you down. And so this is how you start World War III. They're willing to attempt to do it because they're arrogant enough and desperate enough, with emphasis on the word desperate, to try to accomplish this task. So the other thing about NATO is, by creating it as a global institution rather than just a regional one, they think they can sell to the world that we're protecting international interests. We're on the side of the world. We're on the, the global side. We're on the we're on the side of the people of the planet. We have so many countries involved now. We've gone global. But I think the real intention is to essentially move away from the authority of the United Nations Security Council. Because right now, when the US wants and NATO want a war, they previously would bring a resolution to the Security Council and try to get a passage there. But now with Russia and China becoming increasingly obstacles to that strategy, they have to essentially cast aside the United Nations and the Security Council and create their own international institution that they can then say, we have global support. We're doing this on behalf of the entire planet. So that's why NATO expansion is a big issue. And so we've got to punch a hole in that balloon repeatedly and quickly, because it's escalating like crazy.
Well, let's talk a little bit about the United States basically holding a gun to China's head. The Chinese have reacted very strongly and forcibly in the last couple of days publicly with their foreign minister, the head of their military. They basically called out the United States on violating international law and human rights for decades. They said, don't point fingers at anybody, especially us. So, Luke, I want to switch it over to you, and I want to ask you, we've been talking about Ukraine and stop the money, stop the war, stop NATO, peace, stop the killing. Simultaneously, the United States is provoking China in the same way that it provoked Ukraine, shipping arms and advanced weapons into Taiwan, sending every yahoo from Congress to visit Taiwan, which is basically slapping China in the face. And China basically is saying weapons to Taiwan is a red line. Do you feel the danger in provoking another nuclear powered country with 1 billion people, an economy that is growing and not crumbling like the United States economy? US has no industry anymore. They gave it all to China and Mexico. What are your thoughts on the danger of what the United States is doing, provoking China at the same time they're conducting a war in Ukraine?
So my question is just that how is all of this supposed to work? So they've already got a proxy war in Ukraine against Russia, and now for some reason our leaders think that we can somehow strong arm China into accepting Taiwanese independence, which I believe our State Department policy is the one China policy. So our actual policy on the books is that there is one China and Taiwan is part of China. So I'm not actually sure what the end goal here is. And like you said, our industry has been hollowed out. And the last time I checked, we import an awful lot of stuff from China. I had a friend who started a small company where she sold women's athletic clothing, and that's produced in China, So I'm not exactly sure how this is going to work if we provoke a war with China. how are we going to replace all of the imports from China? How is that going to affect our economy? I believe China is holding a lot of our national debt. I just don't understand how this is all going to work kind of logistically, never mind the fact that we're provoking another conflict with a nuclear powered country. So I don't understand how it's supposed to work.
Yeah.
Let me just say, that's your problem, Luke, is you're trying to make sense of these people who are crazy, flat out crazy. It never makes any sense.
So
we can always count on Bruce to tell it like it is and how he feels.
That reminds me of there's a Leo Tolstoy quote who said something to the effect of, the biggest murderers and psychopaths are the people running the countries.
All right. Yeah, this is a very, very dangerous situation. And, you know, I'd like to have you both on again at a future show and not too far in the future to talk about this whole thing with China and Russia, what's happening on a geopolitical scale. But for tonight, I want to sharpen the focus back to what we're talking about. The title was Dissent, Protest, Censorship. Luke, I'm going to come back to you. One of the things that I know is a fact is the censorship in academia. It's happening all across the country. You are a professor at Colby College. What are your thoughts on censorship in general first, and then in academia, how deep it's gone and how effective it's been?
So yeah, just to speak to the Colby College, my relationship with Colby College is essentially that I'm an adjunct professor at Colby in the psychology department. I don't necessarily identify as a Colby College professor so much as identify as someone who teaches courses at Colby on an adjunct basis in their psychology department. So I think technically this year my title is visiting assistant professor because lately I've been teaching more courses there, but the number of courses that I teach at Colby tends to fluctuate a little bit. And next year we're going to be living in Germany, and I will not have I won't be teaching at Colby. I have kind of a sort of like an uncompensated informal role as a research associate, but I'm not a tenure track faculty member at Colby. It's a place where I teach courses fairly regularly. But I just wanted to say that also, just to let you know, I just want to be clear about my views are obviously not. They don't represent the views of Colby College one way or another. So I guess I don't want to be too strongly linked to Colby. But as far as the way I see censorship, I think it's pretty clear that there are certain things that you can say, and there are certain things that you might want to think twice about saying, because there's definitely a culture of what is deemed acceptable and unacceptable speech. And I know that, some of my friendships have suffered because in private, I might say to my friends, I think this and that, or I don't know. I don't know how much detail I want to go into here because I'm afraid of talking about it publicly. So,
yeah. No, I understand. So, fair enough. Bruce, your thoughts on censorship in general, exactly what is it? Where are people feeling it, and what is it doing?
Well, let me tell a story. Last Sunday, just a couple of days ago, I had a long conversation on Zoom with a friend of mine who lives in Canada. She's a PhD student there, and she is very active on the issue of Russia. She recently went to Romania, Russia, Latvia, Poland, several countries, Eastern European countries. And she came back really, in fact, she was in Romania during the last NATO meeting that was held there, and was really kind of aghast at how much demonization of Russia is going on everywhere that she went, now including in her own country. There's a national campaign being run by their government in Canada to essentially bring academia under the boot of this whole anti-Russian program. Students and faculty are being directly threatened there. Their careers are being threatened. That if they don't get in line, they're in danger. So the things that Will is being cautious about are real, and they're happening in the United States as well. This is a problem, because if the institutions of higher learning, where people are supposed to go and learn to think, and you learn to think by considering opinions from all sides, by listening to debates, all those kind of glorious ideas of democracy, right? Well, when you're not allowed to do that anymore, when you're only allowed to swallow one pill, one color pill, but not to, survey other ideas, that's a danger. It's a danger to your own personal rights, but it's also a massive danger to the idea of democracy. How can you claim to be a democracy when you don't allow discussion and debate in your own society? It's ridiculous. So this is a huge, huge problem. And it's only getting worse by the day. And again, I think it's a sign of desperation by the West. They're losing the fight. They're losing the fight when it comes to the war in Ukraine against Russia, the proxy war, and they're losing the idea fight because of social media. And they've tried to clamp down on social media. We've heard the disclosures from Elon Musk after he took over Twitter, how the government was telling the former owners of Twitter to remove X, Y, and Z, A, B, and C. These people, remove them from Twitter because they're not complying with the narrative. I mean, that's a problem. But slowly this information is still seeping through. More people are sharing the stories. More people are whistleblowers, and the cracks in the wall are increasing, and the empire is collapsing. And because of that, their desperate moves only are growing.
Well, censorship, I suppose you could use punishment as a pseudonym. Many of us have been punished, censored. It's no secret I had 550 videos and films and podcasts permanently deleted from YouTube because I went against their community standards, their version of the narrative. People are blocked on Facebook, permanently deleted from Facebook. That's punishment for an individual for violating the rules, but it's censorship because the valuable messages that so many of us have been trying to get out have been squashed. And so you have to find other platforms. You have to find other ways of getting around it. And Bruce, as you said, First Amendment, freedom of speech is the foundation of a democratic society. And what looks like in the United States and across Europe now are banana republics. It's really a shame. I want to talk about Robert F. Kennedy Jr. Now, he came out when he announced his candidacy for the presidency of the United States. He talked about the war in Ukraine. I was really not happy with that. I listened to the whole thing and said a lot of nice things that are going to appeal to a lot of people in America, the common people, the poor people, the peace people. But he mischaracterized the conflict in Ukraine. Now, he's just come out, and I read today an interview that he gave, and somebody basically got to him and educated him about the backstory, the history, and the history of provocations, which Luke alluded to. They go back decades. Now, he said a couple of things that I didn't appreciate because they're unfounded. He first of all said that Russia's special military operation, he didn't call it that, invasion of Ukraine, was illegal. He didn't state how or why, and he didn't state any context for this. Specifically, how many illegal recent wars has the United States engaged itself in, attacking innocent victim countries based on lies? How many coups, how many political assassinations, how many color revolutions the United States is conducting at this moment all over the world? And so he failed to put that into context. The other thing that he failed to do, although he came close when he said, for Russia, this is a visceral war. And what I took that to mean was it's a war for survival, because the stated policy of the United States government is to bring about regime change, get rid of Putin, balkanize the country, and steal its resources. That's no secret. It's all over the place. And so I think he got two strikes on that one. And then the third thing that he said, and this is what drives me crazy, and I want your opinion, both of you, on all of this. He called Vladimir Putin a thug. Now, this woman, I'm not even going to mention her name. She's the press secretary for the White House for Joseph Biden. She came out yesterday and she said Soviet Union didn't win the war. United States did. And she likened Putin to Hitler. Now, this type of name calling not only is blasphemous, but it's disingenuous. Bruce, I'm going to go to you first on that. Your thoughts on this narrative that R.F. Kennedy Jr. is, he modified it, but, these last things that he said just don't cut it for me.
Well, I didn't like it either, and I sent him a message. He interviewed me over a year ago on his podcast where we talked about Ukraine. It was clear to me that he knew the story very well by the questions he asked me. And we had a long conversation. And I know he's interviewed other people since on his podcast about Ukraine. So I know that he knows the story. I heard his 2-hour campaign announcement speech, and I didn't like those things he said either. And so I sent him a message, and I know other people that did that as well. And I have seen people who interviewed him since that also challenged him. And as a result of that, I think he's quickly moved. I think he'd said those things not so much because he believed it, but because he thought it would be politically, he'd put himself in the center kind of thing. But what I told him was, if you're going to be successful, you have to tell the truth. You promised in your speech that you were going to tell the truth. And I said, now that you're starting to kind of hedge here a little bit, you're going to turn people off. And so I think myself and others have gotten through to him in a way that he's beginning to move away from those statements. I've now listened to repeated interviews because I've been curious to see what he was going to say. And I think he's really doing a very good job now. He's come out now calling for the breakup of the CIA, for pardoning Julian Assange, many other good things. And so I'm confident that in his heart that he knows the right thing to say, and that I think over time, as we watch him and encourage him and call upon him, remind him we're listening, we're watching you. We need you to be honest. And so I think he will do that. So that's what I think.
Okay, Luke, you're a different generation than the two of us. We've been disappointed more than once with one election after another, not just on the federal level, but the state levels. We've become somewhat jaundiced about it. As a young person, your thoughts on Robert Kennedy Jr., his statements and his appeal to a broad swath of people in the United States, but specifically your thoughts on the comments that he's made about Ukraine. What's your take on that?
Yeah, so I would say in general, I think that that RFK Jr. is bringing up topics that I think are important, and he's shedding light on things that really need to be discussed out in the open. So I think that that's a good thing. I'm incredibly skeptical of what candidates say during their election campaigns and then what they actually implement after they're elected. And personally, I just don't put a lot of faith in either of the two major political parties to deliver on their campaign promises, specifically when it comes to Russia and RFK's comments about Russia and Putin. I was thinking that that comment that he made about Putin being a thug, that struck me. I guess I don't know how to say it. You know, I don't know. I don't have inside knowledge of every decision that Putin has made, just like I don't have inside knowledge of every decision that Biden or Obama or Trump or Bush W made. I don't have. I don't know exactly every single decision they've made, and so if we're going to define someone, or if we're going to call someone a thug, well, what are your criteria for determining that someone is a thug? And so if we can apply those criteria openly and equally across all leaders, I think you very well could come to the conclusion that many leaders of powerful countries fit that definition. So I'm just not sure what to make of that comment. As far as Russia's launching of the special military operation, I think that there's a case to be made that this conflict actually began in 2014 when Ukraine started shelling its own people in the Donbass and Luhansk. And so if you view the conflict from that perspective, then this has been going on for a long time. And Putin has made it clear that he does want to protect ethnic Russians and people who are being shelled and persecuted. And so from that perspective, I understand the rationale of starting the special military operation. I can't say that I approve it, only because I don't see war and killing as the solution, but I understand why he did it. It seemed, I can understand that it was a rational response to what he saw was happening. And I don't hold Putin to a higher standard than I hold my own leaders. And it is a little bit like the pot calling the kettle black about, countries invading sovereign nation against their will, when currently the United States is occupying 1/3 of Syria, which happens to be the oil producing and wheat producing part of Syria. So I guess that's all I can say.
Well, I'll conclude with this. My thoughts, they want to call Putin a thug and an assassin, a murderer. You've got to go back in just my lifetime to Lyndon Johnson. Every president then has been a war criminal, has murdered people around the world, conducted illegal operations, covert operations, and the beloved Barack Hussein Obama is the worst war criminal probably since Genghis Khan. I mean, he publicly stated how he enjoyed killing. He had his killing Tuesdays. And I'll finish on this point. You know, a lot of people will date the beginning of this conflict in 2014 with the coup. I go, no, 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 no. It goes back to Harry Truman dropping the bombs on Japan to send a message to Stalin. And ever since then, the United States has upped the ante. Ronald Reagan was the worst one who called it the Red Menace, the evil empire, the soulless nation. And then from there on, it just got worse and worse and worse. With military games every year, and Bruce and I have talked about this, all along Russia's borders, you know, gaming a first strike attack on Russia. Are these not provocations? And the United States pulling out unilaterally of every nuclear arms treaty. Is that not a provocation?
Let me say something, Regis.
Bruce, go ahead.
That Ronald Reagan speech where he called Russia the epitome of evil was held at the Sheraton Twin Towers in Orlando, Florida. And I organized the protest outside of that hotel when he was there. And I had a Reagan mask that I wore that day. And I got my picture on the front page of the New York Times back when they would actually cover protests. So I hear what you're saying. And I've been in this game a long time and seen this game run repeatedly by American politicians. I'm no fan of Donald Trump, but I will, in all honesty, recall that when he ran for president the last time, when he succeeded rather, when he ran the first time, he was asked the question about aren't Russians, you know, killing a lot of people? And he goes, well, you know what, Americans, we've killed a lot of people too. That was one of his few really honest statements that he ever made as a political candidate. So anyway, thank you, Regis.
All right, listen, I want to thank the two of you. This has been another really important, interesting conversation that I think a lot of people need to hear. The trick to getting this stuff out there when you're not a big platform is for everybody to share it as widely as they can, and I hope people will do that. Thanks again, and we'll see you both very soon.
Thank you.
Thank you, Regis. Bye-bye.